Okay, great. So, welcome. I hope everyone joining today is safe and healthy and as well as is possible for you right now. My name is Eliza Perry. I've been with the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska for 7 years, mostly on our development team. And I'm so happy to see you on the very first day of July, the perfect day for our second session of the Nature Conservancy's Nature Unites Us online learning series, which is meant to provide some nourishing knowledge as we endure very stressful circumstances together while apart. Check out our website, nature.org/Nebraska. You can see that on Jacob's first slide for all the upcoming Nature Unites Us gatherings. So I'm especially happy Jacob is here with me today. He is the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska's Water and Agriculture Program Manager and has been bridging the conservation and agriculture worlds since 2014. I'm going to hand it off to him in a minute, but first, I want to start by saying a few words about the Nature Conservancy for those unfamiliar with this organization. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We are a conservation organization operating in all 50 states, in 70 or so countries, and we are a science-based organization with about 400 scientists on staff guiding our work. And we're here because of the support from 1 million members worldwide. So if you are one of those members today, thank you for helping this vitally important mission advance. So next, I just have a couple logistics to share. Please look at the bottom of your Zoom screen for the Q&A button, which can be used to submit questions for Jacob anytime. He'll pause a few times to get those. So if you have any technical issues throughout the next hour, please email me, eperry@tnc.org. That was emailed out to you earlier today. And if we do get cut off for any reason, just return to the email sent to you this morning or when you registered to find the very same link, click that, and we'll reconvene as soon as possible. Finally, this is being recorded. So we will send the link out to all participants as soon as we've completed closed captioning, which should be sometime next week. And we encourage you to share it widely. Again, thank you so much for being here. And Jacob, take it away.
Thank you, Eliza. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join this webinar to talk about water. I really enjoy water. I love working in water, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of the stuff that I put together here for you today. I thought a good place to start would be give a little bit of background about myself. As Eliza mentioned, the Water and Ag Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska. I office out of Gothenburg. I also reside in Gothenburg with my wife, 2 little girls, 2 dogs, a cat, a tank full of fish. I'm a native Nebraskan on both my mom and my dad's side. I go back 5 generations in Nebraska. I actually have some ties to water in my family tree. My great-grandfather was a well witcher back in the early 1900s and traveled around Nebraska and the surrounding states helping folks find where to put their wells. Personally, I've lived the bulk of my life in Dawson County, Nebraska, central Nebraska. I graduated from Lexington. I grew up on the Platte River and the surrounding canal system, spent a lot of time out there as a kid, swimming, tubing down the river, boating, hunting, fishing, enjoying wildlife in general. So I've always felt really connected to the river, to water, to agriculture in general. I've been working for the Nature Conservancy now for 6 years. Prior to working for the Nature Conservancy, I worked for Monsanto at the Water Utilization Learning Center here in Gothenburg, which is a demonstration and research farm with the goal of helping high plains irrigated farmers grow more with less. While I was there, I was really interested in sustainable practices. So I went back to school, got a degree in wildlife biology so that I could proclaim myself an agroecologist. I've been with the Nature Conservancy for 6 years now. I came on originally to coordinate an irrigation project in western Nebraska. And I've hung around, continued to help with coordination of projects that help develop our ag program in general. And then I spend a lot of my time working with water resource managers across the state. I really feel lucky, working for the Nature Conservancy, doing something that I'm passionate about. I get to work in my own backyard with water and agriculture, and I do something that I really feel has impact here, not only locally where I live, but it's also work that I think is impactful around the globe. So the flow of the presentation today generally is going to be to talk some about Nebraska's water resources, about water management in Nebraska, how water's been developed, what issues are there, and then talk about why the Nature Conservancy works with water and agriculture and some of the projects that we're doing here within the state. So starting off, let's take a look at Nebraska water resources. Nebraska is really lucky in that we have very abundant water resources. We have over 80,000 miles of river in the state, which is extremely impressive. We also are lucky enough to sit over a lot of groundwater. We're over the deepest part of the Ogallala Aquifer, so we have abundant groundwater resources. If you were to take all of our groundwater resources and extract them and pour them across the state of Nebraska, it would result in 40 feet deep of water. So we have abundant resources, but we also live in a state that has this extreme precipitation gradient as you move across the state. So this is a map of annual precipitation in Nebraska. If you look in the eastern part of the state, these purple spot down in the corner is about 3 feet of rain per year. But by the time you get out to the panhandle, you're roughly a little over a foot. What that equates to is for every 25 miles that you drive east to west across the state, you lose an inch of precipitation. When you look at the crops that we try to grow here in the state, like corn and soybeans, they typically take about 2 feet of water in order to grow. If you look at this map again, that light green line in the center is essentially a transition zone where everything west of that, you don't receive enough from Mother Nature to produce those crops. Whereas the east, you might be able to survive off of just what falls from the sky. So that need for agriculture and those extensive water resources has really led to very extensive development of our resources. So when you look at surface water, starting in the late 1800s, folks started diverting water to the river, directing it to their fields so that they could irrigate their crops. And that development has continued through the years for not only irrigation, but also for power, for other purposes like flood control as well too. And so you end up with just this intricate system, how surface water moves across the state. This map here just highlights one of those. This is Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District. These red blotches and orange lines essentially are the whole system where water is stored in Lake Pecanahe, north of Ogallala, with the purpose of irrigating acres in Gosper, Phelps, and Kearney County 100 miles downstream. We also have really developed our groundwater resources as well. This is a map of the density of registered irrigation wells in Nebraska. The blues are 1 to 2, 2 to 4 wells per square mile, but when you see these red and orange spots that are on here, those are areas where we have densities of wells as high as 16 wells per square mile. So we've really gone out, poked a whole bunch of holes in the ground to pull up that water resource to help us grow crops in the state. So I thought to kind of highlight some of this development and use, it would be fun to maybe take a trip across the state as a drop of water through the Platte River system. We're going to start at the state line with Wyoming and Nebraska, but want to acknowledge that that's not where the Platte River begins. The Platte River actually begins out in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and Wyoming, and it's really dependent on snowpack. And it travels a long way before it even gets to our state line and goes through all sorts of crazy infrastructure out there. But we're going to start our journey right at the state line at the Wayland Diversion Dam. Out in the Panhandle in the Platte River Valley around Scotts Bluff, there's not very adequate groundwater supply. So they really rely upon this surface water in order to grow crops, in order to irrigate their fields. And so this diversion dam actually diverts into two different canals, but we're going to focus on the one on this side, the Interstate Canal. It is part of the Pathfinder Irrigation District. It ends up traveling 95 miles, serves 865 customers, and irrigates 100,000 acres. That irrigation activity on that field isn't completely efficient. A lot of it gets used, but a lot of it runs off as well too. And that's important because it creates return flows into the river downstream of these projects that refills the river for its journey 100 miles further down to Lake McConaughey. Lake McConaughey is Nebraska's largest reservoir. It's over 2 million acre feet, and its purpose is for both irrigation and power generation. This picture is of the morning glory on the dam. It takes in water and it pushes it through the Kingsley hydroelectric plant and generates hydropower. Below Lake McConaughey and Lake Ogallala, there's a diversion into Nebraska Public Power District's supply canal. And this canal takes some crazy path to move across the state. It actually directs water south from the North Platte River watershed into the South Platte River watershed. It actually tunnels that water underneath the South Platte River and makes its way to the east, where it gets to Gerald Gentleman's Station, a coal fire power plant. The water is used for cooling there, continues its path downstream. Eventually, it dumps back into the South Platte River right before the confluence with the North Platte River. But as soon as those two rivers come together, the water is diverted again into the Tri-County Canal System. The Tri-County Canal System has over 500 miles of canals, laterals, and pipelines. It goes through 26 lakes and ends up irrigating 100,000 acres in Gosper, Phelps, and Kearney County. For the sake of our trip, we're actually going to exit that system about halfway through, where there's a diversion point where water can return back into the Platte River right south of Lexington. And the reason we're going there is because the water through that stretch is extremely important from a conservation standpoint. That's the water that helps to maintain the habitat through the Big Bend stretch of the Platte River. Migratory birds rely upon this area, and so water serves a very important purpose as it travels across this geography. Further downstream, we reach the confluence with the Loup River. The Loup River is a system that's not dependent upon snowpack and runoff. It's primarily fed by groundwater that seeps out of the Ogallala aquifer in the Sandhills. And so there's this big influx of water that comes into the Platte River from the Loup River that was generated from those groundwater resources. It's a lot of water too. There's a lot of times that the amount of water that the Loup is contributing at that point actually exceeds what the Platte River is contributing. If we continue downstream a little ways, just northeast of Lincoln at Ashland, Nebraska, you will find these structures here. This is the well structure for the municipal supply for the city of Lincoln. And so the city of Lincoln pulls their water from the alluvial aquifer along the edge of the Platte River. About half of that water is completely dependent upon the surface flows in the river. So extremely important for supplying the city of Lincoln. We continue downstream a little ways further. The Elkhorn flows into the Platte River. The Elkhorn starts up in the northeast part of the state. It has high ag production there. It also has a lot of confined animal feeding operations, and all that activity contributes to a lot of water quality issues that flow down through the Elkhorn watershed and end up going into the Platte River at its confluence, just kind of south of Lincoln and Omaha River. So contributes water quality issues at that point in time. The stretch from there down to the confluence with the Missouri River, where it leaves the state, is often called the Platte River Playground. This is an area that's really heavily used for recreation, camping, fishing, hunting, hiking, swimming, boating, wildlife watching. The park and the rec areas in this area receive more than 3 million visitors per year and account for about $30 million in income for the state. So we made a trip across the state in the Platte River system, and we've seen multiple uses: irrigation, power production, municipal. We've seen how it's benefited conservation. We've seen how groundwater can come into the system and how we can have water quality issues as well too. So all of this development, all of this use inevitably leads to water issues. And so, you know, aside from all of the issues that water in Nebraska creates between people, most of the other issues can really be categorized into either water quantity or water quality. So looking at water quantity, this is a map of groundwater level changes in Nebraska from pre-development through to spring of 2007. So essentially like the last 100 years. This map, the blues and the greens show where water levels have increased, where the reds and the orange shows where we have decreases in our groundwater resources. And you can see we have quite a bit of orange and reds across the state. And that is directly as a result of developing those groundwater resources and not being replenished sufficiently and causing these water quantity issues. We also have water quality issues in the state as well too. The farming practices that we have on our fields, they don't utilize all the nutrients and other products that are put on the field, and that ends up running off the field into our surface water supply. It also leaches down through the ground and returns to our groundwater and creates groundwater issues. This is a map of wells in the state of Nebraska and their concentration of nitrates. Now the green and the yellow dots, those are okay levels of nitrates, but the orange and the red dots that you see on here, which there's quite a few, especially along the Platte River here and in northeastern Nebraska in that Elkhorn River Basin, those are wells that exceed 10 parts per million of nitrate, which is the maximum contamination level for a drinking water supply. So our development has definitely led to water quality issues. So I want to shift a little bit here and talk some about, you know, who's working on these issues and who's involved in water management in the state. Water management in Nebraska is both unique and very complicated. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the underlying reasons is that we have completely different sets of water rights for groundwater versus surface water. So surface water, it works on a prior appropriation model, which basically means first in line is first in right. So whoever the first person was to go out, divert water from the river and put it to beneficial use, they're at the front of the line. And every person after that that took that same activity just falls in line behind them all the way down to the last person to do it, who would be junior right to those senior rights. And what that means is that until that first person on the list gets their water, the other people have to wait. So that's how surface water is managed, but groundwater is managed in a completely different way. It works on a correlative rights model, which essentially means that it's a community resource and your right to it is tied to the land over that water resource. So this conflict in rights causes complication. Additionally, another layer of complication is that there's a lot of different folks that manage different pieces of this as well. Surface and groundwater is divided up here for management sakes as well. So this is a graphic that I really like to show, and it's a little bit cluttered, but honestly, it is about the cleanest and simplest graphic for who's involved in water management in the state of Nebraska that I've found. There's 4 different quadrants on this map. The top side is for surface water, bottom is for ground, the left side is for water quantity, and the right side is for water quality. As I mentioned, surface water is managed by a different entity than groundwater. Surface water is managed at the state level by the Department of Natural Resources, whereas groundwater is managed more locally with our natural resource districts. Those natural resource districts are also responsible for non-point source solution of groundwater within their area, whereas The surface water quality for the state is managed by the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy. So we have this mix of different players that are pulling different levers within the system trying to manage. And there's a lot of conflict between these. You can look through and you'll see a couple other acronyms on there: Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture, Game and Parks. And this just lists very few of the folks that are actively involved in water management across the state. Now, one of these groups that I really want to focus on, because the Nature Conservancy works very closely with them, is the Natural Resource Districts. Now, this is a system that's unique to Nebraska. Essentially, you can see that the state is divided into 23 different districts. These are not based upon political boundaries. They're actually, as you can see, based upon watersheds. These are locally managed. Each one of them has a locally elected board that drives the actions in these areas. They're responsible for a lot of different resource management, but they do have a lot of focus on groundwater quality and groundwater quantity issues. But what's unique about this is because they're local, each one of these NRDs has different issues, and they also go in and come up with different approaches for how they're going to address those issues. And the Nature Conservancy partners with the Natural Resource Districts for a couple of reasons. One is because they're local, they have a really solid understanding of what their issues are and how they can be addressed. So they're a great resource of knowledge. Additionally, they are the front line for working with ag producers. They work with them on water quality and water quantity, on soil erosion, on a lot of different things. But they have those local relationships that are so important when you want to go out and work within these geographies. So to summarize kind of what we've gone through, we've talked some about Nebraska's water resources. We've talked about how they've been developed, how they're used, what issues have been created, a little bit about management. I thought this was a decent spot, early spot, to maybe stop and see if we had any questions that we could address about the content that we've covered.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
So we don't currently have any questions about what you've talked about so far. So I'm going to hold off on the questions we received in advance until the end. And just a reminder to everybody out there, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit any question you have. And I just want to encourage you to do that, because this stuff is really complex and Jacob is an expert, and likely other people have your question too. All right, that's all from me.
Okay. We'll continue on then. So why is it important for the Nature Conservancy to be working with water and agriculture? One of the pillars of the Nature Conservancy's work is to provide food and water sustainably. And the challenge around that is that we are facing a growing global population. Our population has doubled in the last 50 years. We're estimated to reach a population of 9 billion people by the year 2050. And we have to find a way that we can feed, fuel, and clothe this growing population. You know, it's estimated that in the next 50 years, we're going to need to produce more food than we have produced in the previous 10,000 years combined. So this is a huge challenge. And irrigation plays a really important part in this challenge. When you look at some of the big numbers for irrigation across the globe, 73% of global withdrawals are for irrigation. Here in the United States alone, we have 55 million acres of cropland. 1/6 of all the global cropland is irrigated, but that portion of the cropland actually accounts for half of the global crop value. To add to the complexity, 20% of the withdrawals that we take are non-renewable. So we are taking out more than what's going to go back in. As you look across the globe, this is a map of the globe and the aquifers around the world showing their stress level. Blues are in a pretty decent spot, whereas these reds and oranges are where there's a pretty severe scarcity issues. So as you look at the areas that have some of these scarce Scarcity issues, you'll notice that that's also areas that essentially overlap with population growth. And so the consequences of that is that if these water supplies run out, for every 1 acre lost of irrigated ground, it's going to require 2 to 3 acres of non-irrigated ground to compensate for that loss of production. So you can see that this is really, a global food security issue and a global water security issue. And the world is really faced with this challenge where we want to avoid converting native habitat, native ground over into ag land because of loss of our water resources. And in general, the world is faced with this challenge of trying to figure out how we can grow more with less. If we focus in a little bit more locally and see how activities in Nebraska, affect things at more of a regional area, you can look towards Gulf hypoxia. If you look at this map, this highlighted area is the Mississippi River Basin. All of this really light green color is ag production. And so all of that ag production leads to nutrient runoff into the Mississippi River Basin that eventually makes its way down to the Gulf of Mexico and causes this hypoxia, this dead zone where nothing can live because there's just nutrient overload in there. And Nebraska, being part of this system, is a contributor. Our activities with water and agriculture in Nebraska send those nutrients down the system that ends up causing this problem in Mississippi. So what we do here affects us regionally. If we narrow in a little bit closer and take a look here locally on the Platte River, all of our development on the Platte River has had significant impacts on stream flows. This is, if you look at the Platte River and think about what it was historically, it was known as being a mile wide and an inch deep. And it was braided channels with sandbars. And because we changed the dynamics of the river by changing how water moves through the system, you can see that in these pictures kind of how they've changed. On the left is a picture from 1938 of the Platte River right northwest of Gothenburg. If you look in the river channel, you can see multiple active channels that are weaving around these unvegetated sandbars. You fast forward to 1999 and you can see that the flow of water is really constricted to just the northern part of that. And as you look at the southern part of the riverbed, it's inactive. There's not water that flows through, and all of those sandbars are now vegetated. And so it's just drastically changed what habitat we have on the Platte River here in Nebraska. This is habitat that's really crucial for migratory birds. And so, there's all these species that have historically, flown through Nebraska and expected to see what's here on the left and have found what's here on the right. So all of that water development has really impacted habitat along the Platte River here in central Nebraska. So how is the Nature Conservancy working with water and agriculture here in the state? The first effort that I wanted to highlight is the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. Because of that loss of habitat along the Platte River, it's led to there being several endangered species. We have the piping plover up here in the top left, least tern in the top right, whooping crane down here on the bottom left, and the pallid sturgeon on the bottom right. And because of these endangered species and this impact to habitat, in 1997, the states of Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska, along with the Department of Interior and water users and local and national conservation groups, partnered up to develop a shared approach to managing the Platte River to benefit these species. The goal of that is to improve management for the health of both the ecosystem and also the people who depend upon it. The program uses an adaptive management approach, which means that they systematically test hypotheses and then take those learnings and adjust their actions and their management decisions going forward. Early in the program, there was a lot of focus on land management, had a goal of going out to protect, restore, and maintain 29,000 acres of habitat along the critical stretch, which is in between Lexington and Chapman. But lately, a lot of the focus of the program has shifted over towards water goals. Their objective is to use incentive-based water projects to provide sufficient water to improve and maintain habitat for the target species. They do this by retiming and improving flows to reduce shortages by 150,000 to 100, or 130,000 to 150,000 acre feet per year. The Nature Conservancy, our goals line up very well with the program, and we're actively involved. Our Director of Conservation, Rich Walters, sits on the Governance Committee, and I sit on the Water Advisory Committee for this effort. Some other work that we've done on the Platte River that really resonates with me is the control of Phragmites. Phragmites is an invasive plant. It moves in and it really invades the river and ends up choking out the channel. There's two series of pictures that you see here. The top series, these three on the top and the three on the bottom. The three on the top are at Wood River. The three on the bottom are at Grand Island. And you can see on the left, as it progresses, that when the Phragmites was there, it was really choked out. And then over with the effort of this project, they went through and were able to control this through spraying with herbicides and other means as well too. And you can see just how drastic of an improvement it has made to how the river functions there. This really improves conveyance and has a lot of benefits for the system. You can see Rich Walters, our Director of Conservation here, standing next to some Phragmites. It's a really tall plant, really thick. Apparently, Rich started working on this project when he was about 14 years old. But anyways, this project resonates with me because I remember going across the river when it was choked out like you see here. At the time, I was living in Colorado and most of these problems arose, but when I moved back, I remember driving across the river and seeing this nice clear river and thinking that is so impressive. And it just was so pleasant to be able to see the improvement to the river through these actions. So it's just something that's really resonated with me when I was exploring coming to work for the Nature Conservancy and looking to see what they had done. I found that they were part of this effort, and that is kind of what pushed me over the edge to come and join the organization here. So those are two efforts that we've done or that we're involved in on the river. We also have our irrigation projects. And when you think about Nebraska, if you want to work with water issues, you really need to be working with agriculture. They're the primary driver within this system. And so for that reason, 6 years ago, we started doing our ag project. The first of those was irrigation project in Western Nebraska that we called the Western Nebraska Irrigation Project. This was funded by Coca-Cola, John Deere, McDonald's, World Wildlife Fund. We went out and worked in the South Platte River Valley west of Ogallala. We worked over 3 years with 11 producers on 8,000 acres. For reference, that's a third of the producers in the area and about a third of the ground that's farmed there. What we did is we came out and we provided cost share for technology. Those technologies the farmers used to do two things. They did advanced irrigation scheduling, which is figuring out when to turn on and when to turn off your water. And they also did variable rate irrigation, which is changing how your irrigation system moves across the field so that you can vary the amount of water that goes out there and apply the right amount in the right places in your fields. Over the life of the project, in between us and the producers, we spent over $500,000 on these technologies. And when the project sunsetted, we really had positive outcomes all around. Our goal was, to evaluate the benefits to both producers and conservation. Producers had great response to the project when it concluded. They maintained these practices going forward. From a scientific standpoint, we worked with Dr. Trenton Franz at the University of Nebraska and generated a couple of peer-reviewed journal articles on what water savings looks like. We saw that if you use these technologies, that you ended up reducing the amount of water that you applied to your field. And then probably as important as anything else, being our first effort working with agriculture, we were really able to kind of get our feet wet and figure out how to go out and work in this arena, and helped us really build a model of how we can go out and engage. We used these learnings to start up our second irrigation project, which is the Central Nebraska Irrigation Project. This project was funded by Cargill and Nestle Purina. With this one, going back to the importance of partnering up with the NRD, we partnered with Central Platte Natural Resource District on this. We are working with 50 producers over 3 years. And the focus of this is going to these farmers that have maybe a limited understanding of their water situation on their field, and giving them a couple tools that really helps to inform them about what's going on as far as water on their operation. So we provide them with a flow meter, which measures how much water they're applying, a weather station so they know what the conditions are and how much precipitation they've gotten. We give them, we have a cost share program for doing soil moisture probes so that they know how much water is in the soil profile. And then we also provide them with pivot telemetry, which is essentially a fancy word for having remote control access to your pivot. So that's what really gives them the ability to take action on the information that they're getting from these other technologies. And so we are currently in the third year of this project, and it is rolling along smoothly. We're having great results. A little bit of complications on the way. Last year was an extremely wet year with flooding in this area, but we're chugging along and working with these producers to see how these tools really benefit their operation. So not only are we working with irrigation, but we're also working with soil health. We tend to think about water and soil separately, but they're really intimately connected. Healthy soils are important for cleaning up our water supplies. They're also important for helping create resilient fields for drought and flood. And so it's an excellent tool for those reasons. It's also an important tool for fighting climate change. So we've been starting a couple of soil health projects. The first of those being our Upper Big Blue Soil Health Project. This is a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, the Upper Big Blue Natural Resource District, and the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension. Kellogg's is involved as well. And what we're doing with this project is interseeding cover crops. You can see in the top right here, this is us out interseeding cover crops a couple weeks ago. What interseeding cover crops does is, one of the challenge about doing cover crops in Nebraska in the systems that we use is that there's a pretty limited window to plant cover crops after you've harvested your cash crop. Interseeding goes out in the middle of the season before the crop is too high to get over the top of, and plants that cover crop seed at that point in time. Cover crop seed emerges, the cash crop eventually canopies over it, but then when you go out and you harvest your cash crop, that cover crop has had a big head start on being more productive for the year. So we're working with 10 producers. This is our first season. We got all of our interseeding done, like I said, a couple weeks ago, and we're really excited about working with the NRD, working with these farmers and exploring this practice with them. Hopefully it is a tool that can help promote the adoption of cover crops here in Nebraska. Another effort that we have that's just getting started is our Nebraska Soil Carbon Project. This involves 3 supply chain companies, 2 natural resource districts, and the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Services. It's a $8 million project that will go for 5 years. And the goal of this project is to get 100,000 acres of soil health practices out into the geography of the Upper Big Blue and the Central Platte NRD. And we're hoping with this project that we'll be able to get results and quantify carbon and water quality outcomes from this. Now, like I said, we're just getting started with this. We're beginning to work with farmers this fall, but it will really kick off next year in 2021. So in closing, we just spent 40 minutes talking about how complex water is and how the Nature Conservancy is working with water and ag in Nebraska in this space. But I wanted to close on this note. This is Jerry Arnold. Jerry Arnold is a farmer that's involved in our Central Nebraska irrigation project. He was just recently honored by Field to Market for his conservation on his farm as part of the project that we're conducting. This is a piping plover chick. This cute little fellow lives on the Big Bend stretch of the Platte River. And this is my daughters, Lily and Adelaide. And so what we're really trying to do is we want to be an organization that's operating in the background, collaborating with partners, using our flexibility as an organization to bring resource and knowledge to the effort and to help fill gaps and to help push forward the conservation of water in Nebraska, trying to create an environment where farmers like Jerry can be both profitable and conservationists, where the piping plover can live a happy life in the Platte River without experiencing the impacts of water development in Nebraska, and where we can protect our resources for future generations so they have abundant, clean water here in Nebraska in the future. That's all I got. I really appreciate you all attending and listening, and hopefully you have some good questions for me to answer. Eliza?
Hey, yes, we've got lots of great ones. I'm going to start with asking you, how has rainfall changed over the past 50 years with climate change?
That is a good question, and I don't know that I have an accurate answer to it. I can give you my perception. I don't think that the quantity of rain that we receive has changed that drastically. I think where we've really seen changes is in how that rain has come. I think climate change, the way that it's manifested itself here in the state, has really been more in that now we receive more severe events less often, rather than more events with less precipitation in each one, which is challenging for agriculture and challenging for water management as well too. It doesn't benefit you if you get a big heavy rainstorm and then it dries out for a long period of time. We'd much rather have that consistent rain over time. But I don't have an accurate answer on how it's necessarily affected the quantity of rain that we've gotten in the state due to climate change.
Great. What role or organizations at the federal level are involved in groundwater management?
Ooh, that's a good question. Honestly, I'm not aware of one here in Nebraska. There may be with groundwater. Federal agencies are involved with surface water. U.S. Fish and Wildlife would be a good example of that. But groundwater impacts at the federal level, I don't know who would necessarily be involved. They may get involved in some issues, like we have issues in between Kansas and Nebraska where we're not sending enough water across the state line to them, and that involves both groundwater and surface water use, so they might have some role there. But to the best of my knowledge, it's primarily state and local entities that are actively involved in water management in the state from a groundwater standpoint.
Well, that is a great segue to two pretty similar questions, so I'm going to smush them together. Is there concern about capture of groundwater in Nebraska, keeping other states like Kansas and Oklahoma from getting their, quote, fair share? And then the second question is, water issues don't just follow state borders. What are issues posed by neighboring state use?
Okay, good point there. I think that as far as capturing water, most of our water systems are pretty heavily regulated, and it's almost kind of at a static point where there's not much further development that's going on. So I don't think there's a lot of concern about further capturing water. More of it is the impacts of historically how we've captured that water and used that water and how it's impacting how water moves through the state. I mentioned the Republican River as an example where we've developed water to the point where we are not sending enough across the state to Kansas. That aggravates Kansas quite a bit. As far as with Nebraska, we're downstream from both Wyoming and Colorado, and we've had fairly good relationships with them, but there's no doubt that what they do upstream of us impacts what water makes its way here into Nebraska. That fighting over the water between the states is really what led towards that compact between the three states that guides water use in the Platte River Basin.
Great. Is there concern that tools for irrigation efficiency may not be enough to reduce water withdrawals in the absence of policy that limits water use or caps increases in irrigated acreage?
Yeah, so it is very critical that the regulation piece is there from a couple different standpoints. Technologies and better irrigation management at the field level can have positive results, but what we really as an organization are constantly keeping an eye on is, as those improvements are made, what is the consequence of that? What we don't want to see is, we don't want to see more ground being irrigated because of the flexibility that's created by making those improvements. And so that policy piece, that regulation piece, is extremely important for us to have in place to make sure that as these as these improvements are made, that water ends up as water that benefits the environment by increasing stream flows, that it helps to delegate that water across all the different users. We just don't want to see ag make improvements that results in more expansion of ag.
Great. What is TNC doing regarding the nutrient pollution in rivers?
So I mentioned a couple things. The soil health work is really important. And frankly, all of the irrigation work that we do, though it tends to seem to drift towards a focus of water quantity, water quality is just tied to that as well too. Anytime that a farmer is over irrigating, that is excess water is the mechanism that takes those nutrients and moves them off of that field. So a better irrigator not only benefits from a water quantity standpoint, but they also benefit from have benefits from a water quality standpoint. So it's really go out there and actively engaging with the entire ag community on water use, on fertility use, on soil health. All three of those things play a big part in how we can improve agriculture's contribution to water quality issues.
What are your thoughts on the TAPS program? And please explain that acronym if you know it, which uses competition to encourage sustainable farming practices.
That's an excellent question. The Nature Conservancy has kind of had a seat at the table with the TAPS program, which is acronym for Technical Ag Performance Solutions, since the beginning, and we've been a big supporter. I actually sit on an advisory committee for West Central Research Extension Center, which is the facility that conducts the TAPS program. Very supportive of that effort. Essentially, just for a high-level view of what this is, a group of producers makes management decisions on plots at a research farm that UNL has in North Platte. They make those decisions throughout the year. At the end of the year, they all gather and they discuss those decisions they make. They actually give out awards for several different categories. They give out, the first prize goes to the most profitable. The second prize goes to the most input efficient, and the third prize goes to the highest yield, but it's a little bit of a booby prize because the third prize actually gets docked based upon how input efficient they were compared to the other one. So it really tries to put an emphasis on farming for profitability and farming for efficiency. Like I said, we've been actively involved with that. We go down every year to their field day and have a booth set up and have presented a couple times down there, and really think that that is a great effort. The thing that they've accomplished that's very impressive is they've created a peer-to-peer network for farmers to discuss their decisions. And when you look at farmers, they have information coming to them from multiple different avenues. But the folks that they tend to trust the most, aside from their wife and their agronomist, are going to be other farmers. But the problem with getting information from other farmers is that you tend to get it in what we would call coffee shop talk. So you go into the coffee shop and you talk to your neighboring farmer, and he has 300 bushels yields and he made a bunch of money, and it just tends to be unreliable information to judge yourself off of. And this TAPS competition really creates a level playing field where there's very open conversations about what decisions are being made. It's built this peer-to-peer network of farmers that are having an active discussion about how their decisions are impacting profitability and input efficiency. So really, really excited about what they're doing over there at UNL Extension in North Platte.
How does the price of water in Nebraska play a role in the water usage by farmers? Is it expensive? Is it cheap?
So water's cheap. I'll just put it that way. It's not free. You don't pay for water, but you do pay for the energy cost to pump water onto your field. That price really varies depending on a lot of different factors, depending on the setup of your irrigation system in general. There's also a multitude of plans that you can sign up for your energy plan for your well. And so depending on what you sign up for and what your system is, it can vary quite a bit. I typically usually refer to the cost of irrigation water as being somewhere in between $5 to $10 per acre inch, which in the grand scheme of things for a farmer, that's not a huge input cost. This is one of the barriers for increasing irrigation efficiency, is that in regards to cost of water, there's not real significant savings that come through. So the benefits that farmers see from taking those actions really come more from either increasing their productivity, or in a lot of cases it really comes from having that more intimate knowledge and having flexibility across your operation to be able to take better actions results in savings in labor and time, those sorts of resources. It also just generally being more knowledgeable about your water creates a peace of mind with the farmer that is really valuable. And so when we work with farmers on these irrigation, they don't tend to focus on how much did my water cost. They tend to focus on those other aspects as the big benefits that they see from making these changes.
Is the Upper Big Blue Soil Health Project, connected to York's project GROW? And just explain what that is.
Sure. So Upper Big Blue has Project GROW, which essentially is working with the ag production where their well fields are for the city. And so they're out there doing soil health practices on those fields with the hope that that increases the water quality of their municipal water supply. This project is not directly connected to it, but there's a lot of crossover between the two for sure. What we're doing on the Upper Big Blue Soil Health Project fields and what's going on with GROW are absolutely relatable to each other. Being involved with the Upper Big Blue NRD as well too, any lessons that are learned on either side are going to be shared. So they're not directly linked, but they do have a lot of crossover for sure.
Okay, we got a really good critical question. So Nebraska does not produce food from row crops. It produces feedstock and ethanol. Only a small fraction of all row crop acreage is devoted to food production. Why promote water for industrial commodity production that is heavily subsidized instead of focusing on changing the system to produce food? And Jacob, before I let you answer this, can I just editorialize a tiny bit?
Yeah, sure.
So the Nature Conservancy spent a long time thinking about how to work with agriculture, and we do it in diverse ways across the world. And a diverse local food system is something we want to see happen. And as organization, as an organization and as individuals. So there is so much amazing work going on in that space, and we didn't want to crowd in. So instead, we decided to plug in where we felt like we could be most helpful. And that does mean working with big companies to reconfigure their business plans to include conservation in a really meaningful way. So it's not always comfortable for us, honestly, but we know we can get a lot of work done this way. I just wanted to say that before I hand it over to you.
Okay, so that is a good point. You see these big piles of corn in Nebraska, and you're right that that's not, all of that does not end up on our plates and in our bellies. It does contribute to the food system in other ways. It's a key part of feed for beef production in Nebraska, so it ties into food there. And there's also other stuff like high fructose corn syrup where it goes to, or it ties into food. But you're right that there's a lot of crops that are grown that aren't going directly for food purposes there. I think why the work here in Nebraska is really important is that one thing that's really I've noticed in being involved in water, not just here in Nebraska, but in travels more regionally even globally, is that Nebraska really is viewed as a leader in water management and in irrigation. And so, for instance, I went to Spain last year for a conference on aquifers, and I was just amazed that everybody that I met there was all had pretty intimate knowledge about Nebraska and what we do here. We're the #1 irrigated state. And like I said, we have unique water management systems in place that have worked really well through the years. They haven't really had to sustain any sort of long-term drought or something along those lines recently. So let's see how they hold up under that. But in general, we're kind of an exemplar for water around the world. And so I think any lessons that we learn here can have very positive benefits for our water management locally, but there are also lessons that we can export all around the world. We have active conversations with China, with other geographies that have these water issues, where we inform them about what's going on with water management and water activities here in Nebraska. So though we don't necessarily have a very strong impact on food supply with what we're doing, we definitely impact our own local system, and we definitely have influence around the globe based upon what actions we conduct here.
Thanks, Jacob. Can you speak to the rate at which we're utilizing water from the Ogallala Aquifer? And then how long are we predicted to be able to use water at the rate we do now? And is there a point of no return on which the aquifer won't be able to regenerate itself? And just a reminder that we do have folks from all over the place, so reminding what the Ogallala Aquifer is might be helpful.
Sure. My screen's still displaying, correct? I'm gonna bounce back if I can. I'll start at the beginning and get to this map here just to kind of highlight something. So this is a map of the depth of the Ogallala Aquifer. You can see that the Ogallala Aquifer is very deep under Nebraska. As you move south, it gets a lot shallower as you get into Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Here in Nebraska, we're really fortunate in that our water supply, our groundwater supply, is so plentiful that if you look specifically at the Ogallala Aquifer, we're not having a real significant impact on that based upon our water activities for a couple of reasons. One is that deep part of the aquifer underlies the sandhills, and the sandhills, there's not a lot of ag production that occurs there. So we're not poking a lot of holes in there and drawing a lot of water out. So that reduces some of the risk to the aquifer in general. Where we tend to see those groundwater issues in the state, that's really more around, sorry, I clicked forward here a little bit through a bunch of slides, but it's really in areas like in southwestern Nebraska where the aquifer is not as sufficient. One misunderstanding about the aquifer that's very common is that if Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma pull out a bunch of water, that it's going to suck the water dry here in Nebraska, and they're pretty disconnected. So that's just not something that necessarily is going to occur. So in general, we've been really lucky to have this great resource, and we're not really overutilizing specifically the Ogallala Aquifer. We do have other stressed areas of the aquifer in the state. So the system of management in Nebraska has worked pretty well. Like I mentioned earlier, what's unknown there is what happens if we go through some sort of long-term drought again. That's a little bit of an unknown, and could have more impact if we found ourselves in years and years of drought and just really having to pull water out at a high rate in order to compensate.
Great. Okay, it's 1:30 exactly. We didn't get through, I think, one or two questions, so we will, when we send out the recording for this, I'll be sure to get answers from Jacob and put them in that email. So from all of us at the Nature Conservancy, thank you so much for being with us today. I'll let Jacob have the last word, but I hope that all of you tune into our upcoming gatherings online in August and September with other Nature Conservancy and Nebraska staff. And thanks again hugely to Jacob for lending us his mind for the last hour. It's been really fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to jump on this webinar. I hope you learned something. Like I said, I really enjoy this. I like talking about it. I like learning about it. I've been actively involved in it for 10 years and still feel like I only really know just a little bit about all the stuff that goes on out there. I will throw it out there that I'm a water nerd. I like talking about water. So, if you want to call up sometime and bend my ear and ask me questions and discuss water, I'd be glad to field those calls and get on the phone and talk to you further about anything that you had questions with. But once again, thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining today.
See ya. Enjoy your long weekend, your holiday weekend. Happy 4th of July.